democratic societies, of course, are pluralistic and they have these differences in experience, but if they're going to be democratic communities, they also have to hold something in common. They have to have certain common values in order to discuss, to deliberate, to work together in the context of democratic institutions. And when identity begins to stress difference rather than shared experience, or if you say you've got these different lived experiences but no possibility of a common experience, then I think you've got a certain problem. There are other manifestations of this. I think in terms of free speech, this has been discussed a lot. I think this is more an issue in certain universities and in the arts community and so forth, where there is a view that has grown up that the way that I was born determines the way that I'm going to think. So that, and that can be based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender orientation, and so forth. And that is a really ironic outcome because, in a sense, the struggle of modern liberalism was to get away from biological characteristics and say, actually, no, we're all equal human beings, we all have equal agency, and we're going to interact, as this kind of universal, human agent. And instead you're saying, well, no, actually we're all divided into these groups that are determined by, how we're born, our religious traditions, our, biological condition, and that should influence the way that we think about politics, about culture, about a lot of other issues. And so there's something, there's something discordant with a kind of understanding of liberal tradition, I think, that is involved in this sort of identity politics. The worst thing, I think, in a sense, is what it's done. So this understanding of identity that grew up on the left has now triggered a corresponding movement on the right, and that's what Donald Trump represents. So Donald Trump, I think, this is the part that I think a lot of people don't quite understand. A lot of people voted for Donald Trump who are not, workers in manufacturing plants that lost their jobs to China. A lot of people are much better off than that. They still supported him. Partly, it was just kind of Republican partisanship, but partly I think they were responding to this cultural complaint that the left had become so politically correct that you couldn't talk about, issues honestly, and that's why he surprised everybody by calling Mexicans rapists, by the Hollywood Access tape, all of these things that should have sunk a normal politician didn't sink him, and deliberately so, because I think, a lot of his popularity lay in the fact that he was not politically correct. He could challenge, some of these nostrums of the way that, Americans have developed about talking about themselves, and I think that that continues to be one of his enduring sources of popularity. I hate to say this, but I think he's basically a racist, and he's been perfectly happy to be racially divisive. He really got his start in politics by suggesting that President Obama was not born in the United States. He, has been somewhat careful in making overtly racist statements, but I think it's pretty clear that, he's perfectly happy to capitalize on the racial feelings that other Americans have towards each other, and that has been very bad. And so you now have an alt-right and a, kind of set of white nationalist groups that had been, I think, pretty much marginalized over the period since the civil rights movement that are now coming back. So this is not a good situation. This is not a good situation if both the left and the right see themselves in these increasingly biologized identity categories. And my own view is that we need to get back to the 20th century. We sort of have to go back to class, because actually, sociologically, class is the single most important dividing line between Americans right now. If you read, there's a couple of different books that build on the same kind of data. One comes from Charles Murray, his book on the white working class. The other one from Bob Putnam at Harvard, on the other side of the political spectrum. They present exactly the same sort of data, that over the last 30 years, if you look at inequality, it is almost entirely class-based. That is to say, if you have a university education or higher, you've done extremely well in this country, and if you have high school education or lower, you've fallen off a cliff, basically, in terms of your income, and then in terms of, social status. I mean, 72,000, the latest CDC estimate, 72,000 Americans died the most recent year that they can, estimate this for, from this opioid epidemic, most of whom are, rural, working class, white people. So the social catastrophe, in a certain sense, facing, poorly educated Americans, regardless of ethnicity or race or class or gender, is pretty horrific. And within all of the identity groups, you see the same kind of split, where African Americans that have higher educations are doing better, women, so on and so forth. So I actually think that we've got a really big class problem in the United States. It is one that is probably best addressed through, I think, classic social policy. I really like Obamacare. I think that that was an example of something that was not identity-based. It was really a policy meant to give health care to all Americans that didn't have it. And, that kind of a focus should really be the focus of the way that we try to reintegrate our society. I think that national identity is important, but it has to be, and this is where Europe, I think, has got, in a certain way, a bigger problem than the United States, because the United States, I think, by the period after the civil rights movement, had actually arrived at what I would call a civic identity, meaning that our identity was not based on ethnicity or race. It was based on belief in the Constitution, belief in the rule of law, belief in the principle of human equality embodied in the Declaration of Independence. And so you could be naturalized as an American citizen from Guatemala or Korea or wherever, and the moment you took the naturalization oath, you could say, I'm an American, and nobody, would laugh at you for saying that. That's what it means to have a civic sense of national identity. And I thought that that had been an acquired, something that we had really acquired painfully over, the 250 years of American history. And now that's really being challenged by certain people on the right that want to drag us backwards into a more ethnic or racial understanding of what it means to be an American. In Europe, you've got thicker cultures in each individual European country, and therefore the task of integrating newcomers has been a lot harder. So that's one issue. You've got to have a national identity that is open, that fits the de facto multicultural societies that we live in.